The final signature was a simple, dismissive flick of the wrist. Julian Croft slid the pen across the polished mahogany of the solicitor's table. The crisp scratch of nib on paper, the only sound in the stuffy, silent room. He didn't look at Eleanor. He hadn't really looked at her in months, not in the way a man looks at his wife, the mother of his children. He saw only a roadblock, a drab beige obstacle that was finally being removed from his gleaming, high-speed path to happiness. "There," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion. He pushed the stack of papers towards her side of the table. "It's done. You're free, Eleanor. Free to, well, to do whatever it is you do." The insult, cloaked in the language of liberation, hung in the air. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She was a portrait of calm, a stark contrast to the restless energy radiating from Julian. He was already checking his watch, a sleek, ostentatious timepiece that Chloe, his vibrant, ambitious lover, had given him. He was thinking of Chloe now, of her bright laugh and her intoxicating admiration for him, for his career, for the brilliant future they were going to build together. Eleanor finally looked up, her gaze not angry, not wounded, but unnervingly clear. It was the look of a scientist observing a specimen. "Yes, Julian, it's done." He mistook her quietness for defeat. He had been mistaking it for weakness for years. "I've been more than generous," he continued, a magnanimous lord bestowing charity upon a peasant. "The settlement will allow you to find a modest apartment, get yourself settled. It should last you until you find some sort of employment. A receptionist, perhaps, something suited to your skills." He thought of her skills, arranging flowers, planning school fundraisers, remembering his mother's birthday, soothing their 5-year-old twins, Leo and Lily, after a nightmare. Useless domestic talents in his new, glittering world. He was a celebrated cardiac surgeon. Chloe was a rising star in the nursing administration at St. Augustine Medical Center, the most prestigious hospital in the state. They were a power couple. Eleanor was his past. He stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. He felt a surge of triumph, of release. He had done it. He had shed the dead weight. "Don't try to make this difficult, Eleanor. The house will be listed on Monday. You have 30 days to vacate. My solicitor has all the details." Eleanor didn't move. Her eyes drifted to the pen he had just used, now lying between them on the table. It was a vintage Mont Blanc, a gift she had given him for his 40th birthday. He thought she'd saved for a year to buy it. A sentimental extravagance from a woman who didn't understand the value of money. He didn't know that she had purchased it on a whim during a trip to Geneva, paid for with the interest from a single dividend of a portfolio so vast, so deeply hidden, that his entire net worth was a rounding error within it. He didn't know that the very table they were sitting at, in the city's most powerful law firm, was in a building owned by a holding company that reported directly to her. He thought he was the architect of his own success. He had no idea he had been living in a house built, owned, and silently maintained by the woman he was now casting aside like a worn-out coat. Within 30 days, his entire world, a world he believed he commanded, would be dismantled piece by piece, not by anger or by vengeance, but by the quiet, irrefutable gravity of the truth. We've all seen arrogance, but what happens when it crashes against a hidden truth so monumental it reshapes reality itself? If you're ready for a story about quiet strength and the loud, resounding consequences of underestimation, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring you more stories like this, and we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. The memory of the last dinner party they had hosted as a couple was seared into Eleanor's mind. It had been a masterclass in humiliation, delivered with the polite smiles and veiled condescension that had become the soundtrack of her marriage. Julian's mother, Meredith Croft, was the conductor of this symphony of disrespect. Draped in jewels and an air of perpetual disappointment, she had surveyed Eleanor's simple, elegant navy dress as if it were a burlap sack. "Eleanor, darling," Meredith had cooed, her voice loud enough for their guests, mostly Julian's surgical colleagues and their wives, to hear. "You have such a comfortable style. It's wonderful how you don't bother with all the fuss of fashion." Eleanor had simply smiled. "I prefer timeless things, Meredith." Julian, standing beside his mother, had laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of a laugh that signaled his alliance with her. "What my mother means, darling, is that you're a classic, like a well-preserved station wagon." The table chuckled politely. Eleanor felt the familiar sting, but she had long ago learned to metabolize these small poisons without letting them show. Her focus had shifted to her children, Leo and Lily, who were sitting at a small table in the corner, coloring quietly. She saw Leo's small shoulders tense at his father's words. He was a sensitive boy, acutely aware of the emotional currents in a room. She gave him a small, reassuring wink. Her children were her world, the only part of her life with Julian that felt entirely real and true. Later in the evening, Julian had been holding court, describing a complex aortic valve replacement he had performed. His voice was sonorous, confident. He was in his element. He mentioned Chloe's name, not for the first time. "I couldn't have done it without the team, of course. Chloe Reynolds in particular is a marvel. She anticipates every need, streamlines every process. St. Augustine is lucky to have her. She's going places." He had glanced at Eleanor then, a fleeting, comparative look that said everything. "Chloe is a marvel. She is going places. You are sitting here, arranging canapes." He had no idea that St. Augustine was lucky to have Eleanor, that every salary, every piece of state-of-the-art equipment, every expansion wing was ultimately approved by the well-preserved station wagon he so easily dismissed. She had inherited the hospital, along with the rest of the Vance family fortune, upon her father's death 10 years prior. Her father, a man who valued humility and substance over flash and ego, had taught her a crucial lesson. True power is the power you don't have to display. She had kept her ownership a closely guarded secret, managed through a trusted proxy, her father's old friend and the hospital's current CEO, Arthur Pendleton. She had wanted a life, a marriage built on something real, not on the sycophancy that wealth attracts. And so she had watched, and she had waited, hoping the man she married would see her, not the comfortable life she provided. Now she knew with devastating certainty that he never had. He only saw a reflection of his own ambition, and she was no longer a flattering one. The front door closed with a heavy, final thud. Julian was gone. The silence he left behind was immense, a physical presence in the sprawling house that now felt less like a home and more like a museum of a failed marriage. Eleanor stood in the grand foyer, listening to the sound of his car's engine roaring to life and then fading down the long, tree-lined drive. He had taken only his personal effects, leaving behind the furniture, the art, the life they had built, as if it were all hers to deal with. In a way it was. It always had been. He had left the divorce papers on the hall table, a neat stack of white that represented the clinical amputation of their 12-year union. Beside it, he'd placed a check. He had made a grand show of it back at the solicitor's office. "This is the first installment of your settlement, Eleanor. It's more than the court would have awarded you, but I want to be fair. I want you to land on your feet." She picked up the check. $25,000. To him, a surgeon with a seven-figure income, it was a grand, benevolent gesture. To her, it was less than the quarterly property tax on this very house. The absurdity of it was almost comical. He was trying to buy her off with her own money. She slid the check back into its envelope. It would make a fine bookmark. The weight of the last few hours, the last few years, settled on her. She walked through the silent rooms, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Each object was a memory. The piano in the living room, where she'd taught Leo and Lily to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The deep, comfortable armchair where Julian used to read them bedtime stories, back when he still made it home for bedtime. The dining room table where he and his mother had slowly, methodically dismantled her self-worth. She ended up in the library, her father's old sanctuary. The room smelled of old leather and paper and lemon polish. It was the one room in the house that Julian rarely entered, dismissing it as stuffy. For Eleanor, it was a fortress. She walked to the immense oak desk that dominated the space and sat down in the worn leather chair. From a small, hidden compartment in the desk, she retrieved a small, ornate silver key. It was cold to the touch. The key opened a locked drawer on the bottom right of the desk. Julian had once asked what was in it, and she had simply said, "Mementos." He had accepted that, his curiosity never extending beyond the surface of things. Inside the drawer, there was no scrapbook or box of old letters. There was a single, thick, leather-bound portfolio. Her name, Eleanor Vance, was embossed in small gold letters in the corner. Not Eleanor Croft, Vance, the name that held the real power. She opened the portfolio. The documents inside were not sentimental. They were deeds, stock certificates, trust agreements, and financial summaries. On top was the primary holding company's charter, and listed among its assets, in cold black type, was St. Augustine Medical Center. Beneath that, a dozen other major commercial properties, a portfolio of blue-chip stocks that could influence markets, and a foundation so wealthy it could fund a small country. She stared at the name of the hospital. Chloe is a marvel. St. Augustine is lucky to have her. The dramatic irony was a bitter pill. Julian was racing towards what he believed was his future, his prize, completely unaware that he was running straight into her world, a world where she made the rules. A framed photograph stood on the corner of the desk. It was of her and her father, taken years ago at the hospital's groundbreaking for a new pediatric wing. She was a young woman, her arm linked through his. He was beaming, not at the cameras, but at her. "Never let the money own you, Ellie," he had told her that day. "You own it. It's a tool. Use it to build good things and protect the things you love." The things she loved. Leo and Lily, their small faces, confused and sad that morning when she'd had to explain that Daddy would be living somewhere else for a while, swam in her vision. Lily had asked, her lower lip trembling, "Is it because I spilled juice on his chair?" "No, my sweet girl," Eleanor had whispered, pulling both children into a fierce hug. "Never. This is about grown-up things. It has nothing to do with you. You are perfect, and you are so, so loved. Protect the things you love." Her father's words echoed in the quiet library. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge was messy, emotional. This was about protection. It was about creating a future for her children that was stable and secure, free from the corrosive influence of a man who valued image over integrity. It was about ensuring that the world they grew up in was one where character mattered. And to do that, she had to dismantle the false world Julian had built. She closed the portfolio, a quiet resolve settling over her. The game had been Julian's for years. He just didn't realize that she owned the board. The weeks that followed Julian's departure were a blur of curated bliss for him and a quiet whirlwind of activity for Eleanor. Julian and Chloe splashed their newfound freedom across social media with the subtlety of a fireworks display. There were pictures of them clinking champagne glasses at a rooftop bar, the city lights twinkling behind them like a conquered kingdom. There was a weekend trip to a vineyard, Chloe's head thrown back in laughter, a new diamond bracelet, a gift from Julian, catching the sun on her wrist. He captioned the photo, "Finally breathing free with the one who truly sees me." His friends and colleagues, who had long found Eleanor too quiet and reserved, lauded the change. They saw a revitalized Julian, a man unshackled. Meredith, of course, was his most vocal champion. She hosted an impromptu Freedom Gala at her country club, a lavish affair to celebrate her son's new beginning. She made a toast, her voice dripping with saccharine sympathy that didn't quite mask her glee. "To Julian," she'd said, raising her glass, "who has finally found the happiness he so richly deserves, with a woman who can match his brilliance and his ambition. We wish everyone well, of course, but some pairings are simply destined for greatness." Chloe, standing beside Julian, had blushed prettily. She was living a fairy tale. Her promotion to assistant director of patient relations at St. Augustine had come through just a week after the divorce was finalized. She was certain it was a testament to her hard work and talent. Julian was equally convinced. He saw it as confirmation of his superior judgment in women. He was a man who picked winners. "You see," he told her one evening as they lay in the bed of his sleek, minimalist bachelor apartment, an apartment whose rent was more than the entire monthly settlement he'd given Eleanor. "You're a star, Chloe. They recognize it. Together, we're unstoppable." He felt powerful, vindicated. He had made the right choice. He never once considered the invisible architecture of power that structured the world he was so confidently navigating. Meanwhile, in the quiet, sun-filled library of the home Julian thought she'd soon be forced to sell, Eleanor was methodically laying a new foundation. She held a weekly meeting with Arthur Pendleton, a kind, silver-haired man with sharp eyes who had been her father's most trusted advisor and was now hers. "He's flaunting it, Eleanor," Arthur said during one of their meetings, gesturing to a tablet displaying Julian and Chloe's latest social media post. "Are you sure you want to wait?" Eleanor looked at the photo without a flicker of emotion. "Patience, Arthur. Let him get comfortable. Let him believe this is real. Arrogance needs room to grow. When it's fully blossomed, that's when you prune it." Her instructions were precise and strategic. She had Arthur initiate a quiet, top-to-bottom audit of St. Augustine, a standard procedure that wouldn't raise any flags, but would give her a clear picture of every department's efficiency and integrity. She requested a specific deep dive into the patient relations department, where Chloe now worked. "I want to know everything," she said. "Her performance reviews, peer feedback, any complaints, any commendations. I want the objective truth." She also began restructuring her personal finances. With the help of her legal team, the same firm where Julian had so confidently signed away his marriage, she established impenetrable trust funds for Leo and Lily. Their futures would be secure, no matter what happened. She liquidated a few minor, visible assets, creating a paper trail that, if Julian ever bothered to look, would suggest she was struggling, burning through his generous settlement. It was a piece of misdirection, a little bit of theatrical flair she allowed herself. One afternoon, Arthur brought her the preliminary report on Chloe Reynolds. It was unremarkable. She was competent enough. Her performance reviews were consistently average, peppered with sycophantic praise for her superiors. But digging deeper, the peer feedback told a different story. Anonymized comments from her colleagues painted a picture of an ambitious operator, takes credit for team ideas, spends more time networking with doctors than assisting with patient issues, has a habit of misplacing paperwork that might reflect badly on her. There was nothing egregious enough for dismissal, but it was a pattern, a character sketch written in 100 small, selfish actions. Eleanor read the report carefully. "This is useful, Arthur. Thank you. Keep it on file." "What about her promotion?" he asked. "It was signed off by the department head before we knew all this." "Let her have it," Eleanor said calmly. "Let her feel successful. Let her believe she's earned it. The higher the climb, the more dizzying the fall." Her voice was not cold, not vengeful. It was the voice of a strategist, a chess player seeing the entire board 10 moves ahead. While Julian and Chloe were celebrating a captured pawn, Eleanor was positioning her queen for checkmate. Her focus wasn't on the victory itself, but on the inevitable, logical conclusion of the game they didn't even know they were playing. The days settled into a new rhythm for Eleanor. a rhythm of quiet purpose. The frantic, gnawing anxiety that had defined the last year of her marriage was gone, replaced by a steely calm. She was no longer waiting for the next cutting remark, the next casual dismissal. She was no longer bracing for impact. She was the impact. Her memories, once sources of pain, now served as fuel, crystallizing her resolve. She remembered their 10th anniversary. She had planned a romantic dinner at the restaurant where he had proposed. She'd bought a new dress. He had called her an hour before they were supposed to leave. "Eleanor, I am so sorry," he'd said, his voice a performance of regret. "We have a critical post-op situation here, a real emergency. I'm going to be stuck here for hours. I feel terrible." She had believed him, of course. She'd put the food away, blown out the candles, and spent the evening alone, telling herself that a surgeon's wife had to be understanding. 2 weeks later, she'd seen the credit card statement, a charge from that same night for a lavish dinner for two at a trendy new restaurant across town, billed an hour after his emergency call. When she had confronted him, he had been a master of indignation. It was a business dinner with a visiting specialist. Chloe from administration was there to coordinate. My God, can't I even have a professional meal without an interrogation? He had made her feel small and suspicious for even asking. Now, she knew. It wasn't an interrogation she should have conducted. It was an amputation. Then there was the memory of the school's art show. Leo had worked for weeks on a clay sculpture of a dragon. He was so proud of it, and he'd been buzzing with excitement for days, desperate for his father to see it. Julian had promised to be there. He didn't show up. He didn't call. When he got home late that night, smelling of wine and Chloe's perfume, he brushed it off. "It's a kid's art show, Eleanor. I had a major donor meeting. It's called being a provider. You should try to understand the pressure I'm under." Eleanor had gone to Leo's room and found him crying silently into his pillow, his small body shaking. He'd whispered, "Daddy doesn't think my dragon is important." In that moment, Eleanor had felt a rage so pure and cold, it was almost clarifying. Julian wasn't just neglecting her, he was breaking his children's hearts with his casual selfishness. That was the grievance that could not be forgiven. These memories and a dozen others like them were not a litany of self-pity. They were data points, evidence. They formed the bedrock of her decision. This wasn't about a broken heart. It was about a breach of contract, the social contract of a family, a partnership. A contract built on trust, respect, and love. Julian had voided every clause. The news came via a text from Meredith. It was a screenshot of an internal hospital announcement, accompanied by a string of champagne bottle emojis. "Look what my brilliant boy is doing now. The sky's the limit." Eleanor looked at the screenshot. It was an announcement from St. Augustine Medical Center. The long-standing chief of surgery, Dr. Alistair Finch, was retiring. The hospital was conducting a nationwide search for his replacement. It was one of the most prestigious surgical positions in the country. A slow smile touched Eleanor's lips. Of course, it was perfect. The ultimate trophy for a man like Julian. To not only leave his past, but to conquer it. To become the king of the castle his new lover inhabited, the very castle his old wife had never been impressive enough to even tour properly. He would see it as destiny, as the ultimate validation of his choices. He would be supremely, beautifully, catastrophically confident. Chloe would be ecstatic. She would see herself as the First Lady of St. Augustine. They would be the ultimate power couple, ruling the hospital's social and professional hierarchy. They were already planning the parties they would host, the influence they would wield. Eleanor forwarded the screenshot to Arthur Pendleton with a simple message. "Let's make sure Dr. Croft's application receives all the consideration it deserves." Arthur called her within minutes. "Eleanor, are you certain? We could simply reject his application at the preliminary stage. There are dozens of more qualified candidates." "No, Arthur," she said, her voice calm and steady. Let him go through the entire process. Let him interview. Let him get to the final round. I want him to believe it's within his grasp. I want him to taste it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The final decision," Arthur said carefully, "is made by the board, with the majority owner's final approval." "I know," Eleanor said, "and for a decision of this magnitude, I believe the majority owner should probably make an appearance. It's time I took a more active role in the family business." The quiet before the storm lasted for 2 months. 2 months of Julian preparing, networking, and campaigning for the role of his dreams. He was meticulous, calling on every contact, polishing every line of his resume. He felt invincible. His divorce was final, his new life was perfect, and his career was about to reach its apex. He was a man who had bent the world to his will. The final interview was a mere formality, a coronation. He was, in his own mind, the only logical choice. And as he stood before the mirror on the morning of the interview, adjusting his silk tie, he had never felt more powerful or more blind. The boardroom at St. Augustine Medical Center was designed to inspire awe. Located on the top floor of the administrative tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. The table was a single, massive piece of polished black granite, surrounded by 20 high-backed leather chairs. It was a room that radiated power, wealth, and seriousness. Julian Croft felt right at home. He strode in with the easy confidence of a man who believed he belonged there. He greeted the board members he knew with a firm handshake and a familiar smile. There were 6 of them seated around the table, distinguished doctors, shrewd business leaders, and at the head, Arthur Pendleton, the hospital's CEO. Julian had met Arthur at a few fundraising galas over the years. He regarded him as a capable but stuffy administrator, a man who handled the boring parts of the business while brilliant surgeons like himself did the real work. "Dr. Croft," Arthur began, his tone formal and unreadable. "Thank you for coming. We have your portfolio here. It is, I must say, very impressive. Your work in mitral valve repair is groundbreaking." Julian inclined his head, accepting the praise as his due. "Thank you, Arthur. I believe in pushing boundaries. St. Augustine deserves a chief of surgery who is not just a manager, but an innovator." The interview proceeded exactly as he had anticipated. They asked about his surgical philosophy, his vision for the department, his plans for mentorship and research funding. He answered every question with fluid, articulate confidence, weaving in anecdotes of his triumphs and casually dropping the names of influential colleagues. He could feel the room warming to him. He was winning them over. He was winning. After nearly an hour, Arthur Pendleton folded his hands on the table. "Well, Julian, your qualifications are undeniable. On paper, you are an exemplary candidate." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "However, this is a position of immense trust. It requires more than just surgical skill. It requires unimpeachable character and judgment. Therefore, for a decision of this magnitude, there is one final member of the board who must sign off on the appointment. She is the majority owner of this institution and prefers to remain anonymous as a rule, but she has decided to join us for the conclusion of this process." Julian felt a flicker of curiosity, but no concern. The anonymous owner was likely some elderly heiress, a Vance or a St. Augustine descendant, who would simply rubber stamp the board's recommendation. Her presence was a formality. The heavy oak doors at the end of the boardroom swung open silently, and Eleanor walked in. Time seemed to slow down. Julian's brain struggled to process the image before him. It was Eleanor, but it was not his Eleanor. The woman who entered the room was not the quiet, unassuming homemaker in comfortable cardigans. This woman was wearing a razor-sharp, dark gray bespoke suit that fit her perfectly. Her hair was styled not for a school run, but for a corporate takeover. Her face was calm, her posture erect, her every movement radiating a quiet, unassailable authority. She carried a simple, dark blue leather folder. Julian stared, his mouth slightly agape. He felt a wave of cognitive dissonance so powerful it made him dizzy. It was as if his mild-mannered house cat had walked in wearing a lion's mane. He thought it must be a joke, a bizarre, elaborate prank. Perhaps she worked for the hospital now, in some low-level administrative role, and had wandered into the wrong room. But then the other board members began to stand up, one by one, a ripple of deference moving around the granite table. "Mrs. Vance," Arthur Pendleton said, his voice imbued with a deep, genuine respect that Julian had never heard him use before. "Thank you for joining us." Mrs. Vance. The name hit Julian like a physical blow. Her maiden name, the name on the cornerstone of the hospital's oldest wing, the Vance Pediatric Center, the Vance Research Institute. It had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, a clue so obvious he had never once seen it. Eleanor walked to the empty chair at the head of the table, directly opposite Julian. She didn't look at him. She placed her folder on the table and sat down, her movements economical and precise. She surveyed the room, her gaze sweeping over the board members before finally, deliberately, landing on her ex-husband. Her eyes were not the soft, forgiving eyes he knew. They were the cool, analytical eyes of a woman about to make a business decision. The air in the room crackled with a tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. Julian's carefully constructed world, his confidence, his sense of self, began to fracture, the hairline cracks spreading rapidly towards a complete and total shatter. The quiet bomb had been dropped, and he was sitting at ground zero, watching the shockwave approach in terrifying slow motion. A profound, suffocating silence descended upon the boardroom. Julian's mind raced, trying to assemble the scattered, impossible pieces into a picture that made sense. Eleanor, Vance, the Vance Foundation, the owner. It was a cascade of revelations, each one more destabilizing than the last. He felt the blood drain from his face. The confident smile he had worn just moments before was frozen, a grotesque mask of disbelief. The other board members sat down, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and grim anticipation. They had all known, of course. They had known for years that the unassuming Mrs. Croft, who sometimes appeared at charity events, was, in fact, Mrs. Vance, the silent power behind the entire St. Augustine empire. They had respected her desire for privacy. Now, they were about to witness why. Eleanor opened the blue leather folder. She didn't look at the papers inside. Her attention was fixed entirely on Julian. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and carried to every corner of the silent room. It was the voice he had heard 1,000 times reading bedtime stories and asking if he wanted coffee, but it was infused with an authority he had never imagined. "Dr. Croft," she began, the formal title creating an immediate, unbridgeable chasm between them. "Mr. Pendleton is correct. Your surgical record is excellent. We are on that front impressed." Julian opened his mouth to speak, to say what? To apologize? To demand an explanation? But no words came. His throat was tight, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and dawning horror. "However," Eleanor continued, her voice as cool and smooth as the granite table, "the position of Chief of Surgery at St. Augustine is not merely a technical role, it is a position of leadership. It sets the moral and ethical tone for over 5,000 employees. It represents the values upon which my father built this institution, values of integrity, trust, and character." She paused, letting the words settle. She was holding up a moral mirror and forcing him to look at his own reflection. "Let's talk about your qualifications in that regard," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Let's talk about judgment. For the past year, you have been engaged in a clandestine affair with a subordinate employee, a nurse who reported within the chain of command that, as chief of surgery, you would ultimately oversee. This represents a catastrophic lapse in professional judgment, and a blatant disregard for the ethical guidelines that govern this hospital. A murmur went through the room. While Julian's affair was likely gossip among some staff, hearing it laid bare in the boardroom, framed as a disqualifying professional failure, gave it a devastating new weight. You leveraged your position of power over a junior employee for personal gratification, Eleanor stated, not as a jealous wife, but as a CEO identifying a liability. Whether the relationship was consensual is irrelevant from an institutional standpoint. It created a toxic power dynamic, compromised professional integrity, and exposed this hospital to significant risk. Is that the kind of leadership you believe St. Augustine needs, Doctor? Julian was speechless. He felt like he was shrinking in his chair. He looked to Arthur Pendleton for help, for some kind of intervention, but Arthur was looking at Eleanor with an expression of complete solidarity. Eleanor wasn't finished. She slid a single sheet of paper out of her folder. This brings us to Ms. Chloe Reynolds. You have championed her as a marvel, a rising star. Our internal audit, however, paints a different picture. She did not need to read from the page, she had memorized it. According to anonymized peer reviews, Ms. Reynolds has a documented pattern of taking credit for the work of others, of prioritizing networking with senior staff over her assigned duties, and of breaching patient confidentiality through careless gossip. Minor infractions, perhaps, when viewed in isolation. But together, they demonstrate a character that is fundamentally at odds with the ethos of this hospital. Your championing of such an individual does not speak well of your ability to judge character, a critical skill for the person who will be hiring and mentoring the next generation of surgeons. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. You see, Dr. Croft, you came in here today to sell us on your skill with a scalpel. But a leader must also be a steward, a guardian of values. And in your personal and professional conduct, you have demonstrated that you are a man who puts his own desires above his commitments. You break vows. You disregard ethics. You are careless with the hearts of your own children. The mention of their children was the final, devastating blow. It was the one line that crossed from the professional into the deeply personal, and she had delivered it with the precision of a surgeon finding the exact point of mortal vulnerability. Therefore, the board's decision is unanimous, she concluded, her voice ringing with finality. She looked around the table, and each board member gave a slow, deliberate nod. We will not be moving forward with your candidacy. Thank you for your time. Arthur's assistant will validate your parking. She closed the folder. It was over. In 10 minutes, Eleanor had not just denied him a job, she had dismantled his entire identity, brick by brick, in front of an audience of his peers. She had shown him, and everyone in the room, that he was not the powerful man he believed himself to be. He was a small man, a reckless man, and he had just flown too close to a sun he never even knew existed. The silence that followed Eleanor's final statement was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum, of a world suddenly devoid of air. Julian sat stunned, his face a pale mask of shock. The board members began to discreetly gather their papers, their movements careful, as if not to disturb the scene of a recent execution. They avoided looking at him. Eleanor stood up. She gave a slight, formal nod to the board. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. Then, without a single glance at Julian, she turned and walked towards the door, her heels clicking with quiet finality on the marble floor. Julian finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate sound. Eleanor, wait! She paused at the door, her back still to him. We need to talk, he pleaded, stumbling to his feet. You can't do this. This is my career, my life. She turned her head slightly, looking at him over her shoulder. Her expression was not one of anger or triumph. It was one of pity. Your career? Your life? She said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of a final judgment. You made your choices, Julian. You built your life. This is just the bill, coming due. and then she was gone. Arthur Pendleton rose and walked over to Julian. "I think it's time for you to leave, Doctor," he said, his voice polite but firm. A security guard, who had been standing unobtrusively by the door, took a step forward. Julian looked at the guard, then back at the impassive faces of the board members. The humiliation was total. He was being dismissed, escorted out like a trespasser from a building that, an hour ago, he had been sure he was about to command. He stumbled out of the boardroom and into the hushed, carpeted hallway. The world seemed tilted on its axis. Nothing made sense. The woman he had discarded, the woman he had pitied, was the most powerful person he had ever met. His entire marriage, his entire life had been a lie. Not her lie, his. A lie he had told himself about his own importance. News, especially bad news, travels at the speed of light in a hospital. By the time Julian had taken the long, silent elevator ride down to the lobby, Chloe was already hearing the first whispers. A colleague mentioned seeing Julian Croft being escorted out of the executive wing by security. Another had heard that the final board meeting had ended abruptly. Chloe's ambition was matched only by her finely tuned sense of self-preservation. She felt a prickle of alarm. She sent Julian a text. "Heard the meeting was intense. How did it go? Call me." She received no reply. An hour later, she was summoned to Arthur Pendleton's office. She walked in with a confident smile, assuming it was about her new role, perhaps a new project. Arthur was sitting behind his large desk, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Please, have a seat." He didn't fire her. That would have been too simple, too merciful. Instead, he informed her, in calm, bureaucratic language, of the board's new directives. "In light of a recent review of interdepartmental ethics and potential conflicts of interest," he explained, "we are restructuring several roles. Your recent promotion to Assistant Director of Patient Relations is being put on hold, pending a full 30-day ethical review." Chloe's smile vanished. "A review? But why? My performance has been excellent." "Furthermore," Arthur continued, ignoring her question, "to avoid any appearance of impropriety during this review period, we are temporarily reassigning you. Effective immediately, you will be the supervising nurse on the night shift for the long-term care ward in the South Wing." The South Wing. It was the oldest part of the hospital, a place where careers went to die. It was underfunded, understaffed, and housed the most difficult, non-critical cases. The night shift was a graveyard. It was a clear and brutal demotion, a professional exile. "The night shift?" she stammered. "But my work, my projects." "Your projects will be reassigned," Arthur said with an air of finality. "Your hospital email and access to the executive servers will be restricted to your new role's requirements. You'll receive your new schedule by the end of the day. That will be all." Chloe sat frozen, the blood roaring in her ears. She had been so close. The life she had dreamed of, the status, the power by proxy, it was all evaporating. She finally understood. This wasn't a restructuring. This was a message. And it had been sent by Eleanor. The quiet, boring wife she had so smugly replaced held the power to ruin her with the stroke of a pen. Her fairy tale had just turned into a horror story. The fallout spread like a shockwave. Julian, reeling and disoriented, drove not to his sleek apartment, but to the one place he had always sought refuge and validation, his mother's house. He found Meredith in her perfectly manicured garden, snipping roses. He told her everything, the story tumbling out of him in a torrent of disbelief and fury. Meredith was, for a moment, as stunned as he was, but her shock quickly curdled into incandescent rage. "The Vance family?" she spat, snipping the head off a perfect white rose. "She played us. That quiet little mouse was a viper all along. She let us believe she was nothing." "She owns St. Augustine, Mother," Julian said, his voice hollow. "She owns everything." Meredith's sense of social superiority, the bedrock of her identity, could not accept this. Nonsense. We'll fight this. I'll call Beatrice at the Charity Guild. I'll call Stephen at the club. We'll tell everyone what she did. We'll ruin her reputation. A woman that deceitful has no place in society. Meredith spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone, her voice a sharp weapon. She called her circle of influential friends, ready to deploy her well-honed skills of gossip and innuendo. But something was wrong. The conversations were stilted, awkward. Beatrice was suddenly busy with a gala emergency. Stephen was abrupt, claiming he was late for a tea time. Her usual allies were distant, evasive. By evening, she understood. A return call from a friend who was more honest than the rest laid it bare. "Meredith," the friend said, her voice low and nervous, "I think you need to be careful. The Vance Foundation is the primary benefactor for almost everything. The museum, the symphony, the university's new science wing. Attacking Eleanor Vance isn't just bad form, it's bad business." Meredith Croft, the self-appointed queen of society, was being quietly, politely, and completely frozen out. The power she thought she had was social currency, and she had just discovered it was worthless against the real thing. Her influence was a flickering candle in the face of the Vance family's financial sun. She was isolated, her primary weapon rendered useless. Meanwhile, Chloe was living her own nightmare. Her first night shift in the South Wing was a descent into a professional hell. The fluorescent lights hummed, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and despair, and the work was a grueling, thankless slog. Her former colleagues from the administrative wing now looked through her, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. She was a cautionary tale. She confronted Julian when he finally came home late that night, his face pale and drawn. "She did this to me, Julian," Chloe cried, her voice shrill with panic. "That mousy little wife of yours. She ruined me. You said she was nothing. You promised me a life with you, a better life." Julian looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see the vibrant, adoring woman who worshipped him. He saw a panicked, grasping opportunist. He saw that their entire relationship had been built on a transaction. Her admiration for his status, his desire for her flattery. Now that his status was gone, the foundation of their affair had turned to dust. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "How could I know?" "You should have known," she shrieked. "A man is supposed to know his own wife. What kind of fool are you?" The argument was ugly, a death spiral of blame and recrimination. The glittering future they had planned together was now a pile of ash, and they were just two desperate people kicking at the embers. And Eleanor? Eleanor was not reveling in their misery. She was not checking social media or listening to gossip. That afternoon, while Meredith was making her futile phone calls, and Chloe was being handed her new, demeaning uniform, Eleanor was at the park with Leo and Lily. She pushed them on the swings, her face turned up to the sun. She listened to Leo's breathless story about a superhero he'd invented and admired Lily's collection of interesting-shaped leaves. They were laughing, their faces bright and free of the tension that had clouded their home for so long. Later, they got ice cream. As Lily was happily licking her strawberry cone, she looked up at her mother. "Mommy," she said, her voice serious, "are you sad that Daddy's not living with us anymore?" Eleanor wiped a smudge of chocolate from Leo's cheek and looked into her daughter's eyes. "I'm sad about how things happened," she said honestly, "but I'm not sad about our new beginning. Right now, it's just the three of us, and we are going to build the most wonderful, happy life together. I promise." In that moment, she felt a profound sense of peace. Her actions had not been born of hatred for Julian, but of a fierce, protective love for her children. She was pruning the diseased branches to save the tree. Her priority had never been revenge. It was resurrection. The resurrection of a peaceful home, of a stable future, of her own identity as a mother, a leader, and as Eleanor Vance. The professional ruin of Julian Croft was swift and brutal. The story of his public humiliation in the St. Augustine boardroom became the stuff of legend in the city's medical community. It was told in hushed tones in hospital cafeterias and surgeons' lounges. He was no longer seen as a brilliant, ambitious innovator. He was a fool. A man so blinded by his own ego that he couldn't see the truth of his own life. His own hospital, a rival to St. Augustine, suddenly viewed him as a liability. His affair with a junior professional was now public knowledge, a mark of poor character. His failed bid for the chief of surgery position made him look like an overreacher. He was quietly called into his own department head's office. There was no dramatic confrontation, just a cool, professional conversation about reputational damage and the need for a change in leadership. By the end of the week, he had been asked to tender his resignation. Stripped of his prestigious job and his reputation, Julian began to panic. His entire identity was wrapped up in being Dr. Julian Croft, celebrated surgeon. Without that, who was he? His relationship with Chloe disintegrated completely. Their arguments became constant, their shared apartment a battleground of resentment. She blamed him for her demotion. He blamed her for her ambition, which he now saw as a cheap imitation of his own. Within a month, she packed her bags and left, leaving a note that said, "You have nothing left to offer me." She resigned from St. Augustine and left the city, another piece of collateral damage in the wreckage of Julian's life. In his desperation, Julian did the one thing he had left to do. He went to Eleanor. He drove to the large, stately house he had ordered her to vacate, the house he assumed she was now struggling to afford. He fully expected to find a "for sale" sign on the lawn, but there was no sign. The gardens were perfectly manicured, and the house looked as serene and solid as ever. Of course, it was her house. It had always been her house. He rang the doorbell, feeling like a beggar. Eleanor answered. She was wearing simple jeans and a soft sweater, looking every bit the mother he had left, but her eyes held the calm authority of the CEO he had met in the boardroom. "Julian," she said, her voice even, "what do you want?" "I need to talk to you, Eleanor," he said, his voice cracking. I'm sorry. I was a fool. I didn't know. I've lost everything. My job, Chloe, everything." "You haven't lost everything, Julian," she corrected him gently. "You still have Leo and Lily." "Please," he begged, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Take me back. For the children. We can fix this. I can change. I see everything clearly now." This was the moment of his ultimate plea. Eleanor looked at him, and for a fleeting second, she saw the young man she had once loved, the man she had believed in. But he was gone, buried under years of arrogance and neglect. "You see things clearly because your world has gone dark," she said, her voice devoid of malice but filled with an unshakable resolve. "You're not asking for forgiveness, Julian. You're asking for a lifeline. You don't miss me. You miss the life you had, the life you didn't realize I provided." She stepped back, holding the door. "Our children deserve a father, and you will always be their father. You can see them on weekends and for holidays. I will never stand in the way of that, but they also deserve a father who values honesty and integrity, not one who only seeks it when he has no other options left. Our marriage, Julian, is over, irrevocably." He stood on the porch, watching as she slowly, gently, closed the door, shutting him out of the life he had so carelessly thrown away. The finality of it was absolute. It was not a punishment. It was a consequence, a natural and logical outcome of his own choices. Chloe's fate was a quiet fade to obscurity. She had flown too close to the sun and had her wings of ambition melted. Without Julian's influence or Eleanor's unknowing patronage, she was just another competent but unremarkable administrator. She moved to a different state, took a job at a smaller, less prestigious hospital, and the grand, glittering life she had envisioned for herself became a mundane reality of paperwork and quiet desperation. Her story was a footnote in the larger drama, a testament to the fact that a life built on someone else's power is a life built on borrowed time. 6 months later, the city was a different landscape for all of them. Eleanor Vance had stepped gracefully into the public eye, no longer hiding behind her married name or her quiet persona. She had taken over as the chairwoman of the Vance Foundation, becoming one of the city's most respected and influential philanthropists. She was a force for good, channeling her immense resources into pediatric care, medical research, and educational programs. She was often featured in magazines and newspapers, not as a socialite, but as a leader, a visionary. She was radiant, confident, and whole. Leo and Lily were thriving, basking in the warmth of their mother's undivided attention and the stability of their peaceful home. Julian had found work. After months of searching, he had accepted a position as a general surgeon at a small suburban clinic an hour outside the city. The pay was a fraction of what he once earned. The work was routine, unglamorous. He performed appendectomies and hernia repairs, not groundbreaking heart surgeries. It was honest work, and in it, he found a painful, humbling sort of penance. The arrogance had been stripped from him, layer by layer, leaving behind a raw, diminished man. He saw his children every other weekend. He was awkward at first, unused to being a hands-on father without the buffer of a wife and a nanny. He learned to make pancakes, how to braid Lily's hair, how to listen with genuine interest to Leo's elaborate stories. He was no longer the celebrated surgeon performing for an audience. He was just dad, trying to rebuild a connection he had almost completely severed. It was a slow, difficult process, and he knew, with a certainty that ached in his bones, that he could never get back what he had lost. But in this new, smaller life, he was beginning, just beginning, to find a different kind of value. The value of showing up. The moral of this story is not about the triumph of wealth over ego. It is about the enduring power of character. True worth is not measured in status or titles or the admiration of others. It is measured in quiet integrity, in patience, in the love we give to our children, and in the respect we show our partners. Arrogance builds castles of sand on the edge of the tide, magnificent for a moment, but destined to be washed away. Dignity, patience, and love, these are the things that build foundations of stone, capable of weathering any storm. Eleanor chose not to destroy, but to build. She dismantled a toxic present to construct a healthier future for her children. What did you think of her decision? Was it justice, or was it a quiet form of mercy, allowing Julian the chance to become a better man, even if he could no longer be her husband? We'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us for this story. If it resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the power of quiet strength and the importance of true character. Until next time, remember that your real worth is something no one can ever take from you.